It was my first week at Martin Grocer's, and honestly, it was pretty standard. The place was just a small, local grocery store, nothing special, but the pay was decent, and I needed the money. Owen Martin, the boss, was this tall, quiet guy in his late 30s. He was polite, sure, but distant. He barely talked to me, only giving instructions through Nina, who seemed to know the place inside out. On the surface, things were simple. I'd clock in, do my job, and clock out. But I couldn't shake this weird feeling. Every now and then I'd catch Owen looking at me. He'd quickly glance away, but I knew what I saw. It was like he was studying me, or maybe even judging me. I wasn't sure what to make of it. One day, after stocking shelves for hours, I finally had a minute to breathe. I headed to the break room, planning to grab a coffee. That's when Owen walked in. For the first time since I started, he actually spoke to me directly. "How's the first week going?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Good, I guess." "Just trying to keep up," I replied, trying to sound confident. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a little too long. "You're doing fine. Don't stress too much." "Thanks," I said, unsure of what else to say. The conversation felt strange, like there was something else he wanted to say but didn't. Before I could think too much about it, Nina popped her head in. "Hey, Nico, you want to grab lunch? There's a new place down the street." I jumped at the chance. "Yeah, sounds good. Let's go." Owen's eyes followed us as we left the room. I didn't look back, but I could feel his gaze burning into my back. As we walked out, I tried to shake off the odd tension, but it clung to me like a bad smell. Something was up, but I couldn't figure out what. The rest of the day was uneventful, but Owen's stare stuck with me. It was like a puzzle I couldn't solve, and I hated puzzles. I was here to work, not get caught up in whatever weird dynamic was going on. But as I clocked out that evening, I knew I wasn't going to be able to just let it go. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the day in my head, especially that brief exchange with Owen. There was something in his tone, in his eyes, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And for the first time since starting the job, I felt a flicker of unease. What was Owen Martin's deal, and why the hell did I care? The next day at work started just like any other. I was stocking shelves again, minding my own business. Nina was busy at the register, and Owen was doing whatever it is that bosses do, probably in his office, or so I thought. I was kneeling down, stacking cans of beans, when I heard footsteps approaching. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, but it was Owen. He had a cup of coffee in his hand, and before I could even register what was happening, he handed it to me. "For you?" he said, his voice low, almost casual. I blinked, surprised. "Thanks," I muttered, taking the cup. It was from the coffee shop around the corner, the same place I went every morning before my shift. Owen just nodded and walked away, heading back to the office without another word. I stared at the cup in my hand, confused. How did he know my order? I took a sip perfectly made, just the way I liked it. That was no coincidence. I didn't have much time to dwell on it. The store was picking up with the lunchtime rush, and I was needed at the register to help Nina. But as I rang up groceries and bagged items, that damn coffee cup sat in the back of my mind, nagging at me. Why would Owen do that? He barely talked to me before, and now he was buying me coffee. Later, when things calmed down, I found a moment to catch Owen alone in the back office. He was sitting at his desk, typing away on his computer. I knocked on the doorframe, and he looked up, surprised to see me. "Got a minute?" I asked, stepping inside. "Sure," he replied, leaning back in his chair, watching me carefully. "What's with the coffee?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, but I couldn't hide my curiosity. Owen shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up. You've been working hard." "Right," I trailed off, not buying it. "But you knew my exact order. How?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze back to his computer, like he was considering whether or not to tell me. After a moment, he spoke, his voice softer than usual. "I've seen you order it every morning." The air between us grew thick with tension. I didn't know what to say. There was something in his voice, something in the way he looked at me that made my stomach flip. It wasn't just a friendly gesture, and we both knew it. "Thanks," I finally said, breaking the silence. I needed to get out of there before things got any weirder. "I appreciate it." Owen nodded, his expression unreadable. "Anytime." I turned and left the office, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. I mean, bosses don't just buy their employees coffee like that, especially not with this weird intensity hanging over the whole thing. But I couldn't deny that it felt nice, too nice. For the rest of the day, I kept my distance, focusing on work. But every time I caught a glimpse of Owen, that damn coffee cup popped back into my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. When I got home that night, Nina noticed I was off. She asked if everything was okay, and I lied, telling her it was just a busy day. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't the truth. Something was happening at Martin Grocer's, and I had a feeling it was going to change everything. The next few days at work were a whirlwind of awkward encounters and subtle changes. Owen's small gesture with the coffee hadn't been a one-time thing. Every morning, without fail, there was a cup waiting for me when I walked in. He didn't say anything about it, just left it there like it was the most normal thing in the world. I thanked him each time, but the words felt hollow. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. Nina noticed the change, of course. She was sharp like that. "What's up with you and the boss?" she asked one afternoon as we were stocking shelves together. "Nothing," I replied quickly, too quickly. "Doesn't look like nothing," she said, her tone teasing but her eyes serious. "He's been all over you lately. Did you do something to impress him?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool. I guess he just appreciates hard work. "Aha," she said, clearly not convinced but dropping the subject thankfully. I didn't have the answers, and the last thing I needed was Nina digging around and finding something I wasn't ready to face myself. The weirdest part was that Owen had started hanging around me more. If I was in the back room, he'd find a reason to be there too. If I was at the register, he'd suddenly need to check something nearby. It wasn't obvious enough for anyone else to notice, but I felt it. His presence was like a weight on my shoulders, a constant reminder that something had shifted between us. One evening after a particularly long day, I was getting ready to leave when Owen approached me again. He had that same calm, unreadable expression on his face, but there was something different in his eyes, something almost vulnerable. "Need a ride home?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was an undertone I couldn't ignore. I hesitated. Normally I'd jump at the chance for a lift, especially after a day like this, but everything felt too charged, too heavy. "No, I'm good. Nina's picking me up," I lied, glancing around for an escape. Owen's face didn't change, but I could tell he knew I was lying. "All right," he said after a beat, stepping back. "See you tomorrow, then." "Yeah, see you," I mumbled, practically bolting for the door. As I walked out into the cool night air, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he looked at me. There was something unspoken between us, something that neither of us was willing to address directly. But it was there, and it was growing, slowly and steadily, like a storm on the horizon. When I finally got home, Nina was already there, flipping through channels on the TV. She barely glanced at me when I walked in, too absorbed in whatever show was on. I sat down next to her, trying to focus on the screen, but my mind was elsewhere, back at the store, back with Owen. "Everything okay?" she asked, not looking away from the TV. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." It wasn't a complete lie. I was tired, but it wasn't from the work. It was from the constant push and pull in my head, the gnawing feeling that something was changing, something I wasn't ready to confront. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about Owen again, about the way he watched me, the way he seemed to be waiting for something. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew that if I wasn't careful, I was going to find out. And part of me, the part one didn't want to admit existed, wasn't entirely sure I wanted to avoid it. The next morning I walked into the store feeling like I was stepping into a pressure cooker. The usual coffee was waiting for me at the counter, but this time I hesitated before picking it up. I could feel Owen's eyes on me from the back of the store, and it took everything I had not to look over at him. "Morning," Nina called out as she walked past me, a stack of receipts in her hand. I mumbled a response, barely registering her presence. My mind was elsewhere, fixated on Owen and the tension that had been building between us. By midday, I couldn't take it anymore. The way Owen kept hovering around, the way he looked at me when he thought no one else was watching, it was too much. I needed answers, or at least some kind of clarity. So when I saw him head into the back office alone, I decided to follow. "Owen," I said as I walked in, my voice firmer than I felt. He looked up from his computer, surprise flickering in his eyes before he masked it. What's up, Nico? I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for support. We need to talk. He arched an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. About. I swallowed, trying to steady my nerves. About whatever the hell is going on between us. The coffee, the way you're always around me. I hesitated, searching for the right words. The way you look at me. Owen didn't respond right away. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched out between us, thick and heavy, until I couldn't take it anymore. Why, Owen, I demanded, my voice rising with frustration. Why are you doing this? He finally stood up, slowly, and walked around the desk until he was standing just a few feet away from me. The space between us felt like it was shrinking by the second. Maybe I like having you around, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that sent a shiver down my spine. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. That's not an answer. He took a step closer, and I instinctively pressed back against the door. I think it is, he said, his eyes locked onto mine. My heart was pounding in my chest, my thoughts racing. This wasn't how I imagined this conversation going. I expected denial, maybe even anger. But this quiet intensity was something I wasn't prepared for. I have a girlfriend, Owen, I said, my voice trembling slightly. This isn't right. He didn't back off. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering just inches from my arm. Are you sure about that? About what I asked, barely able to breathe. About what's right, he murmured, his gaze intense. Or maybe, about who you are. The question hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and storm out of the room, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. Because deep down I knew he was hitting on something I wasn't ready to face. I started, but the words wouldn't come. Owen's hand finally made contact, his fingers brushing against my arm in a way that sent a jolt of electricity through my body. You don't have to say anything, he whispered, but I think you already know the answer. I jerked away from him, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I need to get back to work, I stammered, fumbling for the door handle. Owen didn't stop me. He just stepped back, his expression unreadable again. Take your time, Nico. I'm not going anywhere. I practically fled the room, my mind a chaotic mess. The confrontation had given me more questions than answers, and I had no idea what to do with any of them. But one thing was clear, whatever this thing was between Owen and me, it was real. And it wasn't going away. As I tried to focus on work, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, his words, the way he seemed so sure about things I couldn't even bring myself to admit. The lines were blurring, and I was losing track of where they were supposed to be. By the time I got home that night, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. Nina was already in bed, reading a book, and she looked up as I walked in. Rough day, she asked, her voice full of concern. Yeah, I muttered, slipping into bed beside her. I didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, but as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't stop thinking about Owen, about the way he looked at me, the things he said. It was all consuming, and I had no idea how to deal with it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with confusing images: Owen, the store, Nina, and that damn coffee cup. Everything was tangled up in a mess I couldn't unravel, and deep down, I knew things were only going to get more complicated from here. The next morning I woke up with a knot in my stomach. The confrontation with Owen played on a loop in my head. I didn't know how I was supposed to face him at work, or if I even wanted to. But skipping work wasn't an option, so I forced myself out of bed, got dressed, and headed out the door without waking Nina. When I arrived at the store, everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. The usual morning rush was in full swing, and Nina was already at the register, chatting with a customer. I slipped into the back to start on the inventory, hoping to avoid any awkward encounters with Owen. But of course that wasn't going to happen. I had just started counting a shipment of canned goods when Owen walked in, his presence filling the small space. I tensed, keeping my eyes on the clipboard in my hand, hoping he'd just grab what he needed and leave. No such luck. Nico, he said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent that made my pulse quicken. I glanced up, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Yeah. He moved closer, his expression serious. We should talk about yesterday. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. There's nothing to talk about, I lied, desperately trying to maintain some sense of control. There's a lot to talk about, he countered, his tone leaving no room for argument. I put down the clipboard, feeling cornered. Look, I don't know what you think is going on here, but... Before I could finish, Owen closed the distance between us in 2 quick strides. His hand came up to cup the back of my neck, pulling me toward him. Stop lying to yourself, he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. My heart slammed against my ribs as our lips crashed together. It wasn't gentle, wasn't tentative, it was intense, hungry, like he'd been holding back for too long, and finally couldn't take it anymore. For a second I froze, my mind screaming at me to push him away, to tell him to stop. But my body betrayed me, responding to the kiss with an intensity that matched his own. I don't know how long we stood there, locked together in the small, dimly lit back room, but when we finally broke apart, I was gasping for air, my hands gripping his shirt like a lifeline. This is wrong, I whispered, but even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow. Is it, Owen asked, his forehead resting against mine, his voice soft and filled with something I couldn't quite name. Or are you just scared of what this means? I couldn't answer. My mind was a chaotic mess, torn between everything I thought I knew about myself and this undeniable pull toward him. I wanted to deny it, to run out of the room and pretend none of this ever happened, but I knew that wasn't possible anymore. He stepped back slightly, giving me just enough space to breathe but not enough to escape. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, Nico, he said quietly. But you need to be honest with yourself, with me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My thoughts were too tangled, too conflicted to make sense of anything. All I knew was that a line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Owen seemed to sense my turmoil and finally stepped back fully, letting his hand drop from my neck. Take your time, he said, his voice steady, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. We'll figure this out. I nodded again, numb, and turned away from him, needing to put some distance between us. As I walked out of the room, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a freight train. I'd kissed my boss, no, he'd kissed me and I kissed him back. There was no denying it now. Things had gone too far. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I avoided Owen as much as possible, focusing on my tasks with single-minded determination. But every time I saw him, every time our eyes met across the store, the memory of that kiss would flood back, sending a jolt of electricity through me. Nina noticed I was off, of course. She was always good at reading me. You okay, she asked during our lunch break, her brow furrowed with concern. Yeah, just tired, I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. She didn't push, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. I was a mess inside, and no amount of pretending was going to change that. When the day finally ended, I couldn't get out of the store fast enough. I needed to clear my head, to figure out what the hell I was going to do. But as I walked out into the cool evening air, I knew one thing for sure: whatever decision I made, it wasn't going to be easy. The morning after the kiss, I woke up feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, confusion, and something else I didn't want to name. The memory of Owen's lips on mine was burned into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake it. When I walked into the store, the air felt heavier, more charged than before. I didn't know if it was just in my head or if everyone else could sense it too, but the atmosphere had definitely shifted. Nina was already there, chatting with a customer like everything was perfectly normal. I envied her for that. I tried to keep my head down to focus on my work, but it was impossible. Every time I saw Owen, I felt a mix of emotions that I couldn't untangle. Desire, fear, guilt, it all swirled together, making it hard to think straight. And then there was Nina. She had no idea what had happened, and that made it even worse. Midway through the day, I was stocking shelves when Nina came over. You seem off, she said, her voice full of concern. I'm fine, I lied, avoiding her eyes. Just tired, I guess. She frowned, clearly not buying it. You've been saying that a lot lately. I forced a smile. Just a rough week. She nodded slowly, still not convinced, but she let it go. Okay, but if something's wrong, you can talk to me, you know. Yeah, I know, I mumbled, turning back to the shelves to hide my face. The guilt was eating me alive, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How could I? How could I explain that I'd kissed our boss, and that I couldn't stop thinking about it? As the day dragged on, I kept my distance from Owen as much as possible, but it was like he was everywhere. Every time I turned a corner, he was there, his eyes following me, his presence a constant reminder of what had happened between us. By the time the store closed, I was a wreck. My nerves were shot, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. I needed to do something, anything, to take control of the situation before it spiraled even further out of control. But of course, fate had other plans. As I was locking up, Owen approached me again. The store was empty, and the silence between us was deafening. I kept my eyes on the door, pretending to fumble with the keys, hoping he'd just leave me alone. But he didn't. "Nico," he said, his voice soft but insistent. I didn't look at him. "What?" "We need to talk." "No, we don't," I snapped, finally turning to face him. The frustration, the guilt, it all came bubbling to the surface. "This can't happen, Owen. It was a mistake." His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hurt, maybe. Was it? "Yes," I insisted, but the word felt like a lie. "I have a girlfriend, Owen, and you're my boss. It's just wrong." He stepped closer, closing the distance between us again, just like he did in the back room. "Then why did you kiss me back?" "I don't know," I burst out, my voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know, okay? But it doesn't matter. We can't do this." He was silent for a moment, just watching me, and I could feel my resolve crumbling under his gaze. Finally, he sighed and stepped back, giving me some space. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's complicated. But I can't just pretend nothing happened, Nico, and I don't think you can either." I didn't know what to say. He was right, and that was the problem. I couldn't just ignore what had happened, but I couldn't act on it either. It was a lose-lose situation, and I had no idea how to get out of it. Owen must have seen the turmoil on my face because he nodded, as if accepting that this conversation wasn't going to go anywhere. "Take the weekend," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Figure out what you want, Nico. I'll give you space, but we can't keep avoiding this." I just nodded, unable to form a coherent response. He gave me one last look before turning and walking out of the store, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echo of his words. As I locked up and headed home, I felt like I was walking through a fog. I had no idea what I wanted, no idea how to fix this mess I'd gotten myself into. All I knew was that the weekend wasn't going to be enough time to sort out everything swirling around in my head. When I got home, Nina was already there, waiting for me. She smiled when she saw me, and for a moment I felt a pang of something close to despair. I didn't deserve her, not after what I'd done, but I couldn't bring myself to let her go either. "Hey," she said, wrapping her arms around me in a hug. "Long day." "Yeah," I mumbled, hugging her back, but my mind was a million miles away. As we settled in for the night, the weight of the day pressed down on me, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Something had to give, and soon. But what? And at what cost?